Mr. Jobs, you're a bright and influential man.
Here it comes.
Sad and clear that on several counts you've discussed, you don't know what you're talking about. I would like, for example, for you to express in clear terms how, say, Java, in any of its incarnations, addresses the ideas embodied in open up. And when you're finished with that, perhaps you could tell us what you personally have been doing for the last 7 years.
You know, you can please some of the people some of the time, but one of the hardest things when you're trying to affect change is that people like this gentleman are right in some areas. I'm sure that there are some things Open Doc does, probably even more that I'm not familiar with, that nothing else out there does. And I'm sure that you can make some demos, maybe a small commercial app that demonstrates those things. The hardest thing is, how does that fit in to a cohesive, larger vision that's going to allow you to sell $8 billion, $10 billion of product a year? And one of the things I've always found is that you've got to start with the customer experience and work backwards to the technology. You can't start with the technology and try to figure out where you're going to try to sell it. And I've made this mistake probably more than anybody else in this room. And I've got the scar tissue to prove it. And I know that it's the case. And as we have tried to...
All right. Hey, welcome to Operation End Times. I'm your Jedi warrior for Jesus, Ben Ellisted. Today is August 27th, 2013, and you know what? The skies were clear and the sun was shining this morning. Today I'm going to go into your jobs as in Steve Jobs and Job, part 3, which is going to be entitled The Apple Odyssey, or is it an oddity? That clip you were watching was Steve Jobs, former CEO of Apple Computers. May he rest in peace. God bless him. You know, Steve was special to me. He was my mentor. And yes, I probably idolized him a little bit. You know, a lot of people hate on Steve Jobs. A lot of people badmouth him, including my older brother. God bless my older brother, but I don't know why. But he can't say one good word about Steve Jobs. He just keeps saying he's nothing special and he never did anything. And you know, my older brother couldn't be more wrong and more blind, and I keep trying to open his eyes. You know, if they were to write a brand new Bible based on stories of the last, 500 years or 1,000 years, since the time of Christ, let's say, but, not repeating the stuff that's in the New Testament, but let's just say the last 500 years. You know what? In that new Bible, there would be a second book of Job, only it'd be called Jobs, and it would be the story of Jobs, because there is so much to learn. This will probably be an hour-long video. There's just so much to say. Sometimes I don't know where to start. But Steve Jobs, here's a quote from Tim Cook, who is now the CEO who took over for Steve Jobs when he died. Tim Cook said, "Steve Jobs taught me that the joy is in the journey." And life is a journey, my friends. We are the sum total of everything that we experience, think, or do in life. And like that video clip, like Steve Jobs, he told that guy, because that guy was some kind of Java programmer, and I was probably in that audience. That looked like it was in Cupertino at the De Anza College auditorium. But Steve told him, he said, Steve was a visionary, and he gave him his biggest philosophy, which was start with the customer experience and work your way backwards towards the technology. Don't start with the technology first. But then he said, I know, I have the scars, the experience. He had already failed, so he had learned, he had grown, the cedar tree was growing up. Steve Jobs was born February 24th, 1955. His father was Syrian. So Steve was Assyrian. His mother was Swiss American. His father was Abdul Fattah Jandali. And his mother was Joanne Carol Shittah. But both of them were going to college in Wisconsin. They were both, I think, doing all right in life. But they gave Steve up for adoption because the mother's family would have nothing to do with his father. Later in life, Steve would try and track down his mother, and he also tracked down his father, but he didn't like what he found when he found his father. So he basically never acknowledged his biological father. He just called him a sperm donor. Both of his parents were highly educated. When they gave him up for adoption, this is almost like something out of a Bible story, but they gave him to a couple who lived in California, Paul and Carol, or Paul and Clara Jobs. And what they didn't like was that Paul and Clara had very little education. Paul, I think, hadn't even completed high school, but they made those parents, the adoptive parents, promise them that they would make sure that Steve Jobs got a college education. And that, in and of itself, my friends, is one of the first miracles of Steve Jobs, because Steve was a rebel, and he had a hard time with school, and he thought colleges charged way too much, because his parents spent their whole life savings to try and put him through college. But he dropped out of college because he said, I'm not going to waste my money and my time. And that's basically been my philosophy. I have a hard time with college because most of my college professors I meet, I'm smarter than they are. And I'm not saying that in a vain sense. It's just, that's the way it is, because they'll be telling you this is how it is, and it's like, hey, I've already experienced that, and that is not how it is. But the irony is, his biological parents made the adoptive parents promise they'd put him into college, and yet Steve's very nature, his being of who he was, made him not able to really get through college. Instead, what he did is he just bounced around taking classes that he liked, and that's pretty much how I've done college. I take classes that interest me, and one of those classes changed Steve's life. He took a calligraphy class. Steve, one reason I just admired that guy is he had a skill set like my own. He had great discernment. He had great ability to ponder, to understand, and to perceive, and to have vision. So, Steve, when he took that calligraphy class, it was like, boom, he saw this big picture of a world where people could manipulate the printed word like never before. And, once again, Jesus is the living word, the Alpha and the Omega, the Aleph and the beginning and the end of the alphabet. Jesus is not only the spiritual word, the verbal word, but he's the printed word too, But Steve Jobs, I think there's so much that ties him into not only what happened in the Bible, but what's happening today as, the end times unfold, man. Jesus, Steve Jobs, he's similar to Jesus. He's similar to some of those old-time prophets, and I'll kind of show you that. But, Jesus was, his father, Joseph, wasn't his natural father because he was born of a virgin. But his father, Joseph, who kind of had to adopt him, was a carpenter. Well, guess what? Paul Jobs was a mechanic and a carpenter. So Steve Jobs' adopted father was very similar to Jesus' adopted father. His biological parents got married after they had Steve Jobs, But they divorced in 1962, which is the year I was born in. So there's another tie-in of me to Steve Jobs. Now, just before I go any farther down this bunny trail, some people might be saying, hey, is he making all this stuff up? I'm going to just show you a few things. This is an Apple employee badge. See, right there, Bent Hellestead, Apple Computers. And it is employee number 2424. You know, I joined Apple in 1981. You know, by the time I left in 1997, there was only like maybe 3 or 4 people in the company that had been there longer than me. You know, I'd been at the company longer than Steve Jobs because he had been kicked out of the company. Now, here's one other thing. You know, I'm going to talk about some stuff at Apple, but for those that, like Harlan, who need to see somebody tear up a Bible to demonstrate their faith, that guy would be sitting here going, oh, Bent never worked at Apple unless he shows me some proof. So I'm going to show you the carnal, physical proof because you don't have the eyesight, the vision to see the light, to see whether somebody's telling the truth. You have to see some kind of manifestation. So here's another manifestation. This is an award that I got. I worked in worldwide operations, but I designed the database that ran all the R&D material on the Cupertino campus, and that was my job. I was a supervisor, I was a senior planner, I was a buyer. You know, but I ran all the logistics. I supported all the engineers in Cupertino. So I had access to just unbelievable stuff. I had a security pass that allowed me to take stuff that wasn't even going to be introduced into the market for 3 years. You know, I was carrying that around, you know. And I had warehouses in Fremont because we had a factory over there, and we had a little manufacturing facility on Bub Road in Cupertino. But anyway, enough about me. I just want to show the proof. But, you know, Steve Jobs, his biological father was Syrian. You know, in the Bible, you know, we hear about Syria, you know, Asher, the cedar trees of Lebanon. You know, right now, that place is, you know, between Egypt, which is in total chaos, the other place is Syria. You know, the president, Assad, you know, is a maniac. He's gassing his own people. But that place throughout history and time, Damascus, you know, that's where the fallen angels came down and took the daughters of men for wives. That's where Jesus went up Mount Hermon, the same mountain, and was transfigured with Moses and Elijah. So, you know, that area of the world is spiritually just super deep. And that's where the roots of Steve Jobs, you know, his father was Syrian. And so Steve Jobs was a cedar. You know, Steve Jobs, in my opinion, what I liked about him is he was a dragon slayer. You know, on our spiritual walk, Steve Jobs, you know, he taught Tim Cook that the joy is in the journey. And that was how he explained to us what we were doing at Apple. We were on a journey to change the world. You know, I loved working there, man. But, you know, Steve, that's what kind of rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, ruffled their feathers, is that he wasn't a respecter of persons. You know, he was a seeker of truth and of perfection. So if you happened to cross his path and you were stumbling, bumbling, you'd have a rough ride with Steve, you know. I never had a problem with Steve. But Steve was a dragon slayer. I've talked about our walk, you know, on the straight and narrow path, you know, becoming a high tower of power, a mighty tree, you know. But first you got to become, you know, we're all vessels. You know, we start as a piece of clay, and what you want to do is not create your own vessel. You want God to mold you into His vessel, and the first thing He's going to make you into is a flask that is up to the task. So you got to prove that you're up to the task, and eventually become a flagon, which is a huge vessel filled with, you know, the knowledge, wisdom, and understanding, the compassion and mercy of God, and you are a flagon ready to slay a dragon. But guess what? Steve Jobs was a dragon slayer. He was a giant slayer. And one of the things about the company, you know, in the early years, IBM became the giant. You know, they would literally show us pictures, you know, like the marketing and whatnot, where it'd be a little Apple guy with a slingshot, and all we'd see is the feet of IBM, you know. But Steve Jobs would say, "We're going to take him down. We're going to slay the giant, Goliath." Once again, you know, Steve was very spiritual. You know, Steve in part one of Your Job, Jobs, and Job, we talked about what's in a name. Well, you know, Steve Jobs made a name for himself. He has a Wikipedia page. I'm looking at it right now. You know, just some notes about it. You know, Steve, at an early point in his career, he was a seeker of truth, seeker of knowledge. It states on the Wikipedia page that he was a Lutheran, and then he shook that off, which is funny because guess what? I was a Lutheran, and I kind of shook it off. You know, I'm not hating on Lutherans, but I just don't call myself a Lutheran anymore. But Steve kind of settled in on Buddhism. You know, now whether he ever found God is questionable, but I would guarantee you God was walking with Steve, whether he knew it or not, man. But in his early years, he was searching for the truth. He got into Buddhism. He was totally into the Beatles. And of course, he named his company Apple Computers, and he got sued by the Beatles. You know, that's how life is, you know. But I like what they said here about Steve Jobs, if I can find it here. Oh, God. Well, what he said about the Beatles, because he was a big fan of the Beatles, he said, hey, man, you know, what's so cool about the Beatles is it's 4 guys, and they keep all their negativities in check, and what their sum total is greater than any of the individual pieces, you know. And that was kind of how Steve looked at life. You know, he wanted everybody on the team to be a valuable member. You couldn't just be a spectator, you know, some guy, or a devil's advocate. You know, Steve hated those kind of people. You know, a devil's advocate, you're there representing Satan, a doubter. You know, oh, that'll never work. Steve would kick you right out of the meeting, and you'd become a hater. I hate Steve Jobs. But one of the things Tim Cook said about Steve Jobs, he said one of the coolest things about Steve Jobs is he could change his mind faster than almost anybody he knew. And that's a sign of being a mature adult spiritually, you know, that you're flexible, and that as you bring stuff into your mind and you ponder it and you mulch it over, you can discern and you can change your mind. You're not afraid to change your mind. You know, you don't become stiff-necked. You know, caught in your own distortion field, shadow path. And here's another interesting fact. In 1981, which is the year I joined Apple, you know, I use the term distortion field and shadow path and vapor trail, you know, bullshit vapor trail. You know, those are like my new terms now. I talk to my family, friends, everybody. But on the Wikipedia page, it says in 1981, a guy by the name of Bud Tribbles, Trouble with Tribbles, coined the phrase reality distortion. And that was describing Steve Jobs' charisma. That it says reality distortion field to describe Jobs' charisma and the effects on the developers working on the Macintosh project. But yeah, you know, Steve Jobs, you know, you spend 5 minutes with him in a room and you would either be hating on him and leaving the room, or you would be captivated and caught up in his distortion field. Now, what I've been telling my friends and family and anybody that will listen is we all project distortions. And that's what it's all about, is manifesting. So that's why you want to make sure you're walking in the light, because then you will manifest something to the glory of God. Whereas if you're in the shadow, in the darkness, you'll manifest something that is not good. Now, me personally, I believe what Steve Jobs manifested, you know, was all positive, but, or with positive intent, and can be used positively. Kind of like the money, or the Bible, even church. You can either get something positive out of it, or do something positive with it, or you can get something negative out of it. It's all in what eyes you want to be looking with. Some of us can look through both eyes and see the darkness and the light. Some people maybe just see the light, they don't see the darkness, but I think that's actually kind of okay. That's kind of being in a hedged-in, bubble-eyed life, but, you know, if you're not seeing the light and you're just seeing the darkness, you're actually hedged in too. You're in a hole, an abyss, a sepulcher of your own mind, a labyrinth, trapped. But if you can see both light and dark, well, then you have true understanding, because you can mulch things over and you can be more effective, because you can deal with both the dark and the light. But I just found that was amazing, that reality distortion field described Steve Jobs, you know, and that's a term that I'm using all the time now. You know, some of the Steve, he got kicked out of Apple by a guy by the name of John Scully, who was a complete scumbag, and he came from Pepsi, a company that is pumping sugar into the vast population of the world at a rate that is unheard of. But Scully had the personality of a dead fish, so Apple was a disaster. And the whole time that Steve Jobs was kicked out of the company, I almost went to work for him because he started a company next. A bunch of my friends were going over there, and they were saying, Ben, come on over. But I didn't go over there. But I stayed a Steve Jobs fan. I had a poster of him in my office. And then he started Pixar. I had a big poster of Pixar. My management would tell me to take the posters down. I would say, hey, screw you, man. Steve Jobs, I'll put whatever posters I want in my office. People describe Steve Jobs as legendary, a futurist, a visionary, the father of the digital revolution, a master innovator, a design perfectionist. And right there, that's got heavy spiritual connotations because God, Jesus Christ, is the master architect. He is the perfect designer. Everything we see in this fourth dimensional reality, the carnal world, was created by Jesus Christ, by the finger and the hand of God. And that's why, those people that talk about the Bible being the mark of the beast, they couldn't be more wrong. Even though some darkness might be in there, the Bible would not be in existence if it were not for God bringing it to manifestation. But that was like a godlike quality that Steve Jobs had, was his quest for design perfection. He was also called the master evangelist of the digital age. And Jesus Christ was the master evangelist of the spiritual age. When Jesus came, he lived the life. He set the example, and that's all he did during his life and his official ministry, was teach others about God's love and being merciful and having compassion. And you know what? Steve had another godlike quality, because he not only could evangelize the digital age, but you know what? Steve's spiritual message, whether he could see God clearly or not, was one of love. Even though, the haters are like, man, he'd trample on me. Oh, well, that's because you were a dragon or a giant, somebody walking around thinking their shit don't stink, but you were in your own distortion wave, and Steve Jobs snuffed it out because he could perceive and see right through your bullshit, man. And that upset you. That put you into a rage and made you want to hate Steve Jobs. But Steve was not a mean person. He was a nice person. I'm going to tell you a story about Steve because I got to get to at least some of my own personal stories. But I found this one quote here. I'm on the Wikipedia page. Let's see if I can find it real quick. Steve Jobs went and looked for his father and his mother, and he had a sister, and he became close friends with her. And his sister, in her eulogy of Steve Jobs after he died, Mona Simpson, she said, I grew up as an only child with a single mother. Because we were poor and because I knew my father had immigrated from Syria, I imagined he looked like Omar Sharif. I hoped he would be rich and kind and would come into our lives and our not yet furnished apartment. So Steve's sister grew up in poverty, and her father not only gave up Steve Jobs, but then he wouldn't support his own daughter and his wife. So he was living in this shadowy marriage, that didn't last. They got divorced the year I was born. But it says, and that she had always hoped that her father would help them. Later, after I met my father, I tried to believe he'd changed his number and left no forwarding address because he was an idealistic revolutionary, plotting a new world for the Arab people. Isn't that amazing? Because that's what's happening over there right now. All the Arabs are fighting each other, just trying to find a better way to live. Even as a feminist, my whole life I'd been waiting for a man to love, who could love me. And I'm not hating on Arab men, but that tradition of taking wives and taking daughters, or fathers giving their daughters, and marriage having nothing to do with love. And the lording over a woman, the man lording, and having basically life and death privileges over a woman, all that kind of comes out of the Islamic world, and it's dark, in regards to marriage. But look at her. She was a feminist, and she was kind of saying, hey, you can't find, a Muslim man, to love you. Because if you love somebody, you wouldn't lord over them, But I'd been waiting for a man to love who could love me. For decades, I thought that man would be my father. When I was 25 years old, I met that man, and he was my brother. That almost makes me want to cry. But, it was Steve Jobs that showed her love. He loved her unconditionally. So people that want to sit there and talk about Steve being some mean dude, that's just because you don't see the light, So, anyway, let me tell you a story about Steve. I met him right when I first joined Apple in 1981. I came into the company right after they'd had what they call a Black Friday. And literally what they did is they gathered all the people, and this was in Sunnyvale at their Java facility. There was maybe 200 people there. They said, everybody gather together. And this was on a Friday. And then they said, hey, we're going to read off a list of names. When your name's read, stand up. And, most people thought, oh, hey, they're giving out some kind of recognition here, So they read everybody's names, and about half the people stood up. And then they said, hey, if your name's been called and you're standing up, you no longer work for Apple. Get the hell out of here. And then thus it was Black Friday. But then, hey, the following Monday, they started hiring replacements, And that's kind of, I came in working as a temporary in the service. The Java facility was the division that serviced all the computers in the field. So we would make support kits for the computers where we'd put spare parts into these little plastic boxes. But you know what? I was a go-getter, and I wasn't there long before I got promoted out of the assembly area into the warehouse, and that kind of became one of my fields of expertise is logistics. But that's when I met Steve. I wasn't even at the company more than like a year, but he came over to the Java facility and he shaved off his beard so nobody in my building recognized him. I sure as heck didn't. The pictures I had seen of him, he had a big old long beard, and a mustache. So anyway, I was in the break room. It was in the morning, about 10 o'clock. I was in the break room taking like a 15-minute break. I was getting a candy bar and a Coke. And then this guy came into the break room, and there was a lot of young people. They liked hiring young people, 18, 19, 20 years old. But this young guy came into the break room, and I didn't know it, but it was Steve Jobs with his beard shaved off. And he came up to me, and I was like, hey, what's going on, man? And he was like, hey, what's up? And he was like, man, this company's pretty cool. And I was like, oh, yeah, Apple computers, I dig it, man. And he looked at me and he goes, so you like working there? It's a good company. And then this is how fate works. I turned to him, not knowing who he was, and I said, well, yeah, it seems like a super duper company, but here's the one thing. Over in Cupertino, there's this guy, Steve Jobs, and all I hear about is that they party nonstop. They have beer busts and parties every Friday. They're always celebrating, and all those people are having all the fun. But over here in Sunnyvale, we don't do any of that stuff. The guy that runs our building, and I'm just going to use his first name, Ray, is a real douchebag. He doesn't treat us right. And what I didn't realize was that Ray's area associate, his secretary, was in the break room, and she heard me dropping the dime on Ray, the building manager. Now, Steve Jobs, he wasn't the kind of guy where he would just go on one person's testimony, but he took note of it. He said, oh, the guy doesn't treat people right. And I was like, yeah, but other than that, working here is great. So I went back to my job, but what Steve Jobs did is he then went around the rest of the building asking people like, hey man, what do you think about the building manager, Ray? Does he treat you right? And of course, everybody was like, hell no, the guy is a real douchebag. But you know what? God bless Ray, man. Wherever you are out there, I hope you're still on the planet. God bless you, man. I was young in those days myself. But anyway, everybody basically backed me up. So the next thing you know, Steve Jobs is like, I want to see Ray, and I want to see him now. And he started walking around the building going, Ray, and yelling his last name, where are you? So the word kind of spread. People figured it out. It was like Steve Jobs is in the building, and he wants Ray. And they kind of got word to Ray. Ray was a pretty big, tall dude, a giant, He was taller than me. I'm 6'1", so Ray was like 6'4", And Ray liked to kind of lord over people from his management position. That's why people didn't quite like him, you know. But anyway, Ray was just like, oh my God, I better find Steve and just snuff out whatever's going on here. But as fate would have it, the warehouse was in the middle of the building, and there was offices on either end of the building. So Steve came out of one end walking into the warehouse, and Ray came out at the other end walking into the warehouse, and right in the center of the warehouse they met, and that's where I was and everybody was, you know. Everybody kind of congregated because it was just this event happening. And Ray, just like me, he didn't recognize who Steve was because he had shaved off his beard. So when the two of them met in the middle of the warehouse, big giant Ray, the big bad manager, the big bad wolf, he thumped Steve Jobs 3 times in the chest, and he was like, who the hell are you? What's your name? You know? And of course, Steve Jobs, he kind of cranked on back, got his 2 fingers, and he was like, I'm Steve Jobs, and just thumped Ray as hard as he could right in the chest. And Ray was just like, the giant was staggered like Goliath, man. But you know what? Steve was a cool cat. And you don't sit there and, you know, beat your manager in front of everybody. So he said, follow me. And he took him into the woodshed and put some lumber to him. So, you know, that could have been the end of the story, but it wasn't. But Steve Jobs now knew who I was, and I now knew who Steve Jobs was. And that was the beginning, you know. I don't know if I can get into all the stories today because I don't want this video to be 3 hours long. So I think I'm going to do a second video on Jobs. But what happened on that occasion is Steve Jobs left, and he told Ray, you better get your people's attitudes fixed, and the next time I come out here, they better be all singing with joy, talking about how happy they are to work here. So then, you know, Ray, he was just like, how did this all happen? And then his area associate, his secretary, said, you know, that young guy, that new guy, Bent? He was the guy that dropped the dime on you in the break room to Steve. So next thing I know, Ray is walking through the building yelling out my name. Bent Ellisted, where are you? Ah, the ogre, the giant, you know, was lumbering through. But, you know, that's another quality that me and Steve share is, you know, he was a dragon slayer, he's a giant slayer. Well, so am I, my friends. You know, when the sailing gets rough, that's when I get going. So giants don't scare me either. So I was sitting at my desk and I heard Ray calling, but I thought, you know what, he can come to me. And he came to me. He had never really given me the time of day. You know, I was just another lowlife to him. But he came up to me and he goes, I heard you are the one that dropped the dime on me and told Steve Jobs that I was a douchebag. And I just said, well, hey, the truth hurts, but, you know, yeah. And then he looked at me and he goes, I suppose you could do a better job. You know, you think you're, you know, Mr. Stockroom dude that doesn't know anything? You think you can fix employees' morale around here? And I looked at Ray and I said, you know, yeah, I can, because how hard is it to do better than nothing? Like, you do nothing, so yeah, I could do better than that. So then, you know, Ray, he put me to the test. He said, all right, then I'm putting you in charge of employee morale. But I was smart enough even back then where I said, you know, employee morale costs money, so I need to have some budget. I need to have a budget and authority to spend some money to improve morale. So Ray then gave me an Apple checkbook, and for the next 3 years, I could write checks on Apple to whoever the heck I wanted to for whatever I wanted to. But see, I knew Ray had kind of laid a little snare, a trap for me, you know, because he felt, hey, surely Bent will mismanage the money, and I will be proven correct that even if employee morale goes up, it'll be a budgetary disaster, and that man, you know, doesn't have the vision to see the fullness of that you also have to work within corporate restraints of monetary budgets. You know, but guess what? I knew that. So I did all my events for the next 3 years. I planned them very carefully, and I had a lot of friends. You know, I had a friend that was a butcher, so I got all these deals, whether it was on pizza, on alcohol, and we did all the events I did. I would always stage these crazy things, you know, games to play. I remember one picnic we did in the summer. There was a TV show that was called American Gladiator. So I set up an American Gladiator course in the park, you know, and what it was is the employees were the gladiators, and we made management run the gauntlet, and the employees never had so much fun in their lives because they got to throw water balloons and, you know, shaving cream pies and just, you know, take out all the frustrations on the management, you know. But it not only improved employee morale, but it improved the teamwork and the continuity and the flow and the cooperation. So, you know what? Everything I did was kind of blessed. And even Steve Jobs, he came to a couple of those events and he saw it. So, my career is that after I was in service for 3 or 4 years, I then transferred to the startup of the Fremont Macintosh factory. The day I walked into that factory, it was just a hollow building, and then we took it from there. I spent 3 or 4 years at the Macintosh factory, and then when they started up the Cupertino New Product Operations Group, I was one of the founding members. And actually, I have a picture of that. I'll show you the picture of that in part 2, so you can just see how crazy an individual I was back in those days. At Apple, they love people that were colorful. See this? I could wear this at Apple. They would love that. There was no dress code. Steve walked around in blue jeans. Steve was a modest man. Despite being the 42nd richest man in the world when he died, he lived a modest life. He bought a mansion, but he let it fall into disrepair because he didn't really care about that kind of stuff. He actually lived in a house in Palo Alto that it was 2 blocks away from where my mother lives in Palo Alto. So, I've walked over to his house many a time, because he lives right next to where my mother is. Or he did live there. Steve, the Apple logo is kind of spiritual because it's like the Garden of Eden where it has a bite taken out of it. The knowledge of good and evil has the rainbow color, like the rainbow. Jesus is the rainbow. But he named one of his daughters Eve. I don't really want to bring his children into this, but just the fact that he named a daughter Eve shows that he was absolutely, on that spiritual circuitry. I believe Steve Jobs was a blessed individual, that God was flowing to him and through him. But just like all the walk of the mighty, we share things in common. One, we relish the adventure, the journey, the excitement, the change. But once you're on that path, where you're changing the world, you're rising up, you're becoming a giant slayer, you're going on an odyssey, and you're bringing people with you on your ship. And I will say, any of you that are regular viewers, that your mind is comprehending what I've been laying down to you, you're on board the good ship Bent, and we're on a journey like never before, my friends. We're searching for a distant shore, and it's only a matter of time before we crash, and we take a firm hold and take the land, So I would just say, may God bless you all if you're on board the ship. And guess what? I still got room for more people, so come on board. Come sail away with me. Jesus is the captain, I'm just maybe a helmsman or something. I don't know. I'm just glad to be on the boat. Just give me an oar. I yearn to row. There's no turning back. Tuma and Fala, Dragarula. That means it's time to attack the dragon, to slay the dragon, my friends. And that is the amazing times that we are literally living in, that are unfolding right in front of our eyes. And that's why, if you don't want to be slain, because if your master, if you're walking the shadow path, the darkness, the dragon, Satan is your master, they all go down together, Whereas if you're on the light path, and God bless Steve Jobs, I hope to see him again someday. I know I will, because that's how God works. God is all merciful, all loving. And even those people, the dragons like Harlan, God is bending over backwards, man, pleading with people like that to say, shake off the dust, shake off the shadow, come out of it, into the light, the truth. Walk in truth and love. Jesus came to save everyone. Everyone. All right, hey, this is Operation End Times. The Apple Odyssey begins. I'm going to warm up for part 2. The Odyssey continues. But may God bless you all. May you all be living lightning rods for the finger of God and for the kingdom of God. High towers of power, because there is darkness out there. It's spreading, the herd mentality. People trying to sweep you up into whatever their distortion fields are, their carnal thoughts, the vile imaginations of their own mind. Don't be a part of it. Mind fast. Plow your field. Get rid of the stones, the stumbling blocks, the seeds of doubt and fear, the demons, the skeletons, whatever it is you're carrying around, the baggage. Release it all and let the glory of God come on into your mind, body, and soul, and let it refresh you and renew you, and you will reemerge as a new man, a citizen for the kingdom of God. And, first and foremost, you have to have Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. And you do have to repent and talk face to face with God and face all your demons, in order to bind them up and cast them out so that they disappear and they're removed. You uproot all that stuff so that you can walk in righteousness and glory and walk into a brave new world and change the world in ways that we can't even imagine, my friends. And that is what the world needs. What the world needs now is love, sweet love. We need Jesus. We need God. All right. This is Ben Hellstead, your Jedi Warrior. Take care.